Emma Lewis hurried up the courthouse steps, clutching her notebook tightly. She was 5 minutes late. Again. Her bus had been delayed by morning traffic, but she knew Judge Arthur Wells wouldn't care about excuses. He never did. As she slipped into the courtroom, she felt his cold eyes follow her. Judge Wells sat high above everyone else, his gray hair perfectly combed, his black robes pressed and proper. Emma quietly took a seat, hoping he might ignore her today. "Ms. Lewis," his voice boomed across the room. "This is the third time you've disrupted my courtroom with your tardiness." Emma stood up straight. "I apologize, Your Honor." Judge Wells frowned down at her. Unlike most people who stood before him, Emma didn't tremble or look afraid. This seemed to annoy him even more. "This court finds you in contempt. You will pay a fine of £500 within 30 days. Emma nodded calmly. "Yes, Your Honor." She sat down and began writing in her notebook, recording every word in detail with care. Judge Wells watched her for a moment before moving on to the next case. Emma stayed for the entire morning session, watching how the judge spoke softly to some people and harshly to others. She noticed how he gave lighter sentences to well-dressed men in suits while being strict with others who looked poor or different. She wrote everything down. When court ended, Emma walked home to her small flat above the local bookshop. She lived simply but had walls lined with books about law, justice, and history. She opened her laptop and added today's notes to a growing document titled Blind Justice, the biography of Judge Arthur Wells. No one knew about her project yet. Not her friends, not her editor, and certainly not Judge Wells himself. For 3 months, she had been watching him, studying him, and now experiencing firsthand how he treated different people in his courtroom. The £500 fine would hurt her budget badly. Emma worked as a freelance writer, and money was often tight. But she considered it a small price for what she had learned today. She made herself a cup of tea and reviewed her notes. The next day, Emma returned to the courthouse on time and sat quietly in the back row. She watched a businessman arrive 5 minutes late, just as she had done. Judge Wells merely nodded at the man and asked him to be seated. No fine for him, Emma whispered to herself, making another note. A week later, Emma was having lunch at a small cafe near the courthouse when a shadow fell across her table. She looked up to see Judge Wells standing there, his tall figure blocking the sunlight. "Ms. Lewis, isn't it?" Emma's heart jumped, but her face remained calm. "Yes, Your Honor." "May I join you?" he asked, gesturing to the empty chair across from her. "Of course," she replied, closing her laptop slightly. Judge Wells sat down, looking uncomfortable outside his courtroom. Without his robes and his high bench, he seemed smaller somehow. "I've noticed you in my courtroom quite often," he said. "Are you a law student?" Emma considered lying but decided against it. "No, Your Honor. I'm a writer." "A writer?" His eyebrows lifted. "What kind of writing requires regular attendance at court sessions?" "I'm researching our justice system," she said carefully. "How it works in practice, not just in theory." "And that's why you were repeatedly late?" "For research?" Emma met his eyes directly. "Yes. I needed to understand the system from all angles. Including as someone who breaks the rules." Judge Wells frowned. "That's quite extreme for research." "Is it?" Emma asked. "I think to truly understand something, you need to experience it from every perspective. Don't you agree?" The judge looked troubled. For the first time, he really looked at Emma, not as a disruption in his courtroom, but as a person with purpose and intelligence. "Your research sounds thorough," he said finally. "I'm curious to read it when it's done." Emma smiled slightly. "I hope you'll find it enlightening, Your Honor." As Judge Wells walked away, Emma opened her laptop again and added these new observations. She hadn't planned to meet him like this, but perhaps it was meant to be. The biography she was writing would show the real man behind the gavel, his prejudices, his power, and perhaps, if she was lucky, his potential for change. 3 weeks after their cafe meeting, Judge Wells found himself thinking about Emma Lewis more than he cared to admit. Something about her calm confidence and direct gaze had unsettled him. He had looked her up online and discovered she was a respected writer who had published books on social issues. This made him even more curious about her interest in his courtroom. One rainy Tuesday, Judge Wells received an envelope in his chambers. Inside was a formal letter from Emma requesting an interview for a book project. His eyes widened as he read the subject line, "Blind Justice, the Biography of Judge Arthur Wells." He sat back in his chair, stunned. She wasn't just writing about the justice system. She was writing about him. That evening, they met at a quiet restaurant far from the courthouse. Emma arrived on time, dressed in a simple blue dress, her natural hair framing her face. Judge Wells had abandoned his usual formal attire for a casual sweater and trousers. "Thank you for meeting me," Emma said as they sat down. "Your letter was surprising," he replied. "Why me?" "There are more famous judges with more interesting cases." Emma placed a small recorder on the table. "May I?" When he nodded, she pressed record. "I chose you because your career spans 30 years of changes in our justice system. You've judged thousands of people from all walks of life. Your rulings tell a story about justice in Britain that I find fascinating." "And what story is that?" he asked, suddenly feeling defensive. "That's what I'm trying to understand," she said. "I spent 3 months observing your courtroom before you noticed me. I saw patterns in how you handled different cases." Judge Wells shifted uncomfortably. "Each case is unique." "Yes," Emma agreed. "But similar cases should receive similar treatment, shouldn't they?" She reached into her bag and pulled out a folder. "On March 12, a white businessman named James Porter was 5 minutes late to your court. You gave him a warning. The next day, I was 5 minutes late and received a £500 fine." The judge felt his face grow warm. "That's hardly the same." "I was late 3 times total," Emma continued calmly. "Always exactly 5 minutes. It was part of my research methodology. I tracked 15 cases with similar minor infractions. The data shows a clear pattern in your responses based on the person's appearance, gender, and race." Judge Wells stared at the papers she had laid before him. Part of him wanted to get up and leave, to dismiss her as just another critic who didn't understand the complexities of his job. But something kept him seated, perhaps the methodical way she had approached her research, or the lack of accusation in her voice. "You deliberately broke court rules as an experiment?" he asked finally. "Yes. I believe in thorough research," Emma said. "I wanted to understand how it feels to stand before you. The powerlessness. The fear. And I wanted to test if you would treat me differently than others." "And your conclusion?" "That you're a man who believes deeply in justice but has blind spots you don't recognize," she said. "That's what makes you interesting to me. Not your flaws, but whether you can see them when they're pointed out." Their food arrived, and they ate in silence for a few minutes. Judge Wells found himself studying Emma as she ate. She was younger than him by at least 20 years, but there was a wisdom in her eyes that made him feel like the student, not the teacher. "Why are you telling me all this?" he asked finally. "Most biographers don't warn their subjects about unflattering conclusions." Emma smiled slightly. "I'm not interested in ambushing you. I want to understand how a good man can make unfair judgments without realizing it. And I wondered if, when shown the evidence, that man might change." Judge Wells felt something shift inside him, a crack in the certainty he had carried throughout his career. What if she was right? What if his idea of fairness wasn't as impartial as he believed? "I'd like to see more of your evidence," he said quietly. Emma's face showed surprise, then something like hope. "I can show you everything I've gathered." "But are you sure you want to see it?" "No," he admitted. "But I think perhaps I need to." As they left the restaurant, rain still falling gently around them, Judge Wells realized that for the first time in decades, he was the one being judged. And the verdict would depend not on his power or position, but on his willingness to face uncomfortable truths about himself. For the next month, Judge Wells met with Emma weekly to discuss her research. Each meeting left him feeling more unsettled than the last. They would sit in a quiet corner of the library, surrounded by law books that had once given him comfort but now seemed to judge him from their shelves. Emma had created detailed charts showing his sentencing patterns. She had matched cases with similar crimes but different outcomes. The numbers didn't lie. People with white skin received shorter sentences than people with dark skin. Men received lighter punishments than women for the same crimes. Well-dressed people with good jobs were treated better than poor people. "This can't be right," Judge Wells said during their third meeting, pushing the papers away. "I've always been fair. I follow the law." "The law allows for judgment," Emma replied gently. "And judgment is influenced by things we don't always see in ourselves." She played recordings of his voice in court. In one, he spoke kindly to a young white man who had stolen from a shop. In another, his voice was hard and cold toward a young black man who had committed the same crime. "That's not. I didn't," he stammered, hearing the difference clearly for the first time. Emma didn't press him. She simply collected her papers and suggested they continue next week. "Take some time with this," she said. "It's a lot to process." That night, Judge Wells couldn't sleep. He went to his home office and pulled out old case files. He stayed up until dawn, reading through his own words, seeing patterns he had never noticed before. How had he missed this? How had he believed himself fair while being so clearly biased? When morning came, he called the court administrator and canceled his cases for the day. Then he did something he hadn't done in years. He drove to the cemetery where his wife was buried. Mary had died 8 years ago. She had always been his moral compass, gently questioning him when he became too rigid in his thinking. Without her, he had become more set in his ways, more certain of his rightness. "I think I've made some mistakes, Mary," he said quietly to her gravestone. "Big ones." The following week, Judge Wells arrived at their meeting with red-rimmed eyes and a thick folder of his own. "I'd been reviewing my cases," he told Emma. "You're right. I've been unfair, and I didn't even know it." Emma looked surprised. She had expected more resistance, more denial. "I found something else too," he continued, pulling out a letter. "This came to the court 5 years ago. A complaint about my sentencing from a community group. I dismissed it without really reading it." "What will you do now?" Emma asked. Judge Wells looked tired but determined. "I don't know yet. But I can't continue as before. Not now that I've seen this." For their next meeting, Judge Wells suggested they meet at a community center in the part of town where many of the people he had sentenced lived. As they walked through the neighborhood, he saw it with new eyes, not as a high-crime area but as a place where people lived, worked, and struggled against systems stacked against them. They sat on a bench in a small park, watching children play. "Some of these children have parents I've sent to prison," Judge Wells said quietly. "I never thought about what happens after I make my rulings. I never saw the full impact." Emma nodded. "That's why I brought you here. A judge's decision doesn't end in the courtroom. It ripples outward, affecting families, neighborhoods, generations." A small boy kicked a football toward them. Judge Wells stopped it with his foot and gently kicked it back, earning a shy smile from the child. "Your book," he said, turning to Emma. "Will it ruin me?" "That depends," she replied honestly. "On what you do with what you've learned." Judge Wells watched the children playing, thinking about justice, fairness, and second chances. "I've spent 30 years handing down judgments," he said finally. "Perhaps it's time I faced judgment myself." As they walked back toward the bus stop, Judge Wells felt something he hadn't felt in years, the discomfort of growth, of old certainties falling away, of new understanding taking root. It hurt, but beneath the pain was something else. Something like hope. "I have an idea," he told Emma. "Something that might make a difference. But I'll need your help." Emma smiled, seeing the change in him that she had hoped for but hadn't dared expect. "I'm listening," she said. Judge Wells spent the next 3 weeks gathering information, making phone calls, and having difficult conversations with colleagues. He spoke with retired judges, community leaders, and people who had stood in his court. Many doors closed in his face, but enough open to give him hope. Emma helped him organize his findings, adding her research to his. Together, they built a case stronger than any he had presided over, a case about justice itself. "Are you sure about this?" Emma asked one evening as they worked late in his study. "Once you start, you can't take it back." Judge Wells looked at the photographs on his wall. His younger self standing proudly in his judge's robes. His late wife, Mary, whose voice he could almost hear encouraging him to do what was right, not what was easy. "I'm sure," he said firmly. "I've spent my life believing I served justice. Now I need to make that true." On a rainy Monday morning, Judge Wells walked into the Judicial Review Board meeting. The room fell silent as he entered. These were his peers, other judges, court officials, people he had worked with for decades. They looked at him with curiosity and concern. "Thank you for agreeing to this emergency meeting," he began, his voice steadier than he felt. "What I'm about to share will be difficult to hear. It was certainly difficult for me to accept." He placed Emma's research on the table. Charts, statistics, recorded patterns of bias in his own courtroom and others. The evidence was clear and damning. "For 30 years, I believed I was a fair judge," he continued. "Ms. Lewis's research has shown me I was wrong. My sentences have been consistently harsher for people of color, for women, for the poor." Murmurs spread through the room. Some faces showed shock, others discomfort, a few showed angry denial, the same denial he had felt himself just weeks ago. Judge Wells, the head of the board, interrupted, "We all have difficult cases. Cherry-picking examples doesn't prove." "This isn't cherry-picking," Judge Wells said firmly. "This is 3 decades of data. And it doesn't just apply to me." He laid out more papers, evidence showing similar patterns across multiple courtrooms, multiple judges. "Our system has built-in biases we don't want to see," he explained. "I'm not here to place blame. I'm here to propose solutions." For the next hour, he outlined his plan: mandatory bias training for all judges, regular review of sentencing patterns, community oversight panels, and a program to revisit cases with possibly unfair sentences. When he finished, the room was silent. Then Judge Margaret Thompson, the oldest serving judge on the bench, slowly stood up. "Arthur," she said, using his first name in this formal setting, "what you're suggesting would change everything about how we work." "Yes," he agreed. "That's precisely the point.